We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, continuing our conversation with Tim Donner. Now, Tim, just for the break, I put forth a wild theory that what's happening in Washington, D.C. is actually crumbling a more globalist mindset around the world. And I want to make my case to you here. And if it all makes sense, I might even write this up for the pages of libertynation.com, delving a little bit deeper. So what's happening is there's been a very cozy consensus on the world stage about what should happen in terms of policies. There's been no real surprises. There's been known knowns. There's been known unknowns. We're talking about the Rumsfeld matrix.
The Donald Rumsfeld doctrine, right?
Yeah. But Donald Trump has introduced something else, and those are the unknown knowns and the unknown unknowns on the four corners of the Rumsfeld matrix. I love the term the Rumsfeld matrix. And so what's happening is, where there's always a consensus on what can happen, there was a slow deliberative process to things that happen. And this was all collectively managed or managed in a collectivist manner by places like the United Nations, the WEF, and various other supranational organizations. But with Donald Trump, he's forcing individual countries to be dynamic. So on Monday, February 10th, he imposed a 25% steel tariff, a steel and iron tariff, I think it was, or steel and aluminum tariff. And so what happened was, for example, on Canada, and Canada went completely mad with it and started putting out statements where we've got to do this, we've got to do that. But what was happening was they started operating. Now, we don't know what the end result of that will be, but they started working towards coming up with a solution that was beneficial purely for Canada in that arrangement. There wasn't any cooperation with outside organizations or the general globalist community, because they have to react on a fast-paced basis. So the decision-making mechanisms have to be brought closer to the decision-making authority. And so when that happens, you're forcing nation states to be individually dynamic in how they deal with internal politics and, for example, exports and the global stage, which is cutting the global power players out. But it's also cutting the people who have an interest in a global leadership. It's cutting them apart from their compatriots within that movement, because they need to operate on a Canada first basis, a Mexico first basis.
Yes.
And that's my theory. So what do you make of it?
Well, what I would do to support that theory is something that Donald Trump said during his first term that went largely unnoticed or unreported. He said, yes, I believe we have to make America great again. We need an America first agenda. But then he said, but every country should do that. Italy should be Italy first. Brazil should be Brazil first. England should be England first. In other words, he's saying you should defend your own sovereignty the same way that we are. And then we would have an equitable world that wasn't dominated by this global mindset. And I note that in your own United Kingdom, that Nigel Farage is now the most popular among the three parties, the Brexit, the Conservative, and the Labour Party. He has now soared in popularity, which is, something that even after Brexit, which Farage mostly led the movement, he was not anywhere near the most popular politician. But that reflects on another fact. The way that Trump has forced these countries to defend their own sovereignty and their own interests is because things come closer to home. And he who governs least governs best is the old statement, but it's also true on a domestic basis that what Trump is trying to do is remove the federal government every place that the authority can go to the individual states, which is why he wants to, for example, disperse the Department of Education. He wants to end it and send direct block grants to states to decide because the state is far closer to its population than the federal government is, and even more so local government. In other words, the closer a government is to its constituents, the more accountable it must be. That's a very basic principle. But I think Trump is also
Yeah.
working on one other factor, and it's sort of the crazy man factor. In other words, these countries say, you never know what Trump might do. We better be really
Hmm.
careful with this guy. And I think he plays that up. He wants to keep it beyond everything else. He wants to keep people off balance and believing he's willing to do almost anything to get his way.
You know, that I'm not an economist and I don't play one on television, but there's within game theory, there's a couple of ideas. There's one that there's the Nash equilibrium by John Nash, and that's that if you're in a non-cooperative game, no player can gain an advantage by changing their strategy. That's essentially the globalist position, right? With some exceptions, of
Yes.
course. And then you have there's I think it's called the dominant strategy that is that each player's optimal move is or should be unaffected by those of the other players. And we seem to have forgotten that Donald Trump, for even though he's all America first, he is about competition very, very much. He wants America to be number one. And how are you number one? Well, by measuring yourself against other nations. So he's not saying that uh, you have to, for him to win, somebody else has to lose. But what he's just saying is that
Yes.
I should win, and it should be very clear that I've won.
In other words, globalism is essentially a zero sum game,
Yes.
whereas the Trump philosophy is a plus sum game
Yes.
where every player is going to benefit by competing. And that's just human nature. Competition brings out the best in people because it forces them to compete. And when you're forced to compete, that stimulates creativity, it stimulates focus, to be sure, and it stimulates the need to satisfy your own constituents in competition against the rest of the world. But globalism basically is a vanilla, one size fits
Mm.
all philosophy that has been discredited and is no longer popular with the American people. And as you've pointed out rightly, ever more unpopular across the world. You can see this in England and in Germany and throughout Europe. And increasingly, I think it will hit South America and Africa as well.
With Drive, that drive has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last 100 years. Whereas the opposite of that competitive streak, that open competitive market position is often the socialist type or the even the
Right.
communist type in many
Because
cases.
there are no free elections.
Yeah.
So therefore, the dictator or whoever, whatever he calls himself, is not forced to compete. He's not
Chairman.
forced to come up with solutions, chairman,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it. That's why democracy, the most important feature of democracy is elections, because every candidate has to compete by offering what they think is superior to the voters. And that competition forces politicians in the long run to perform. And if they don't, they know they're going to get kicked out of office.
Mm.
Witness Joe Biden.
Yeah, it also reins people into the middle as well when they're campaigning because nobody on either extreme, the left or the right, can really definitely get elected. So that they tend to move towards the center. Now, where do you think, just a quick final question for you, Tim, where do you think that political center is today?
Well, I think America always has been a right of center country that occasionally strays to the left with a strong personality like a Barack Obama. But I think people are in a different mindset because they now actually believe that they could have restored confidence in their government because they're finding out what they've been doing for these many decades. And they know that the person in charge is trying to do something to rebuild that long lost confidence among the American people.
Tim Donner, thanks for a great conversation.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest today, longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner, for his wit, his wisdom, and all-round super knowledge. And of course, thank you guys, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in each week and join us. Please remember, libertynation.com does not sponsor campaigns, candidates, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.